Welcome to Lanterns and Luminaries. Tonight's festivities are a celebration of those who spark change and make history. I want to start by acknowledging a few folks who have helped make this evening possible. Gold sponsors Meet Boston, Ann Bailey Berman and Roger Berman, and Alan Snyder. The Old North Illuminated Board of Directors, and the Lanterns and Luminaries Host Committee. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge the Old North Church congregation and the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts, with whom we collaborate in stewarding Old North Church into its next 300 years. Lanterns and Luminaries is a celebration of the historic actions of April 18th, 1775, the eve of what we now know as Patriots' Day, a holiday that is only celebrated in 6 states. As a city, we celebrate Patriots' Day with a blend of history, the Red Sox, the marathon. It's a truly unique Bostonian experience. But I'm not sure that many of us stop to reflect on what this day means and why it matters. Patriots' Day commemorates the first battles of the American Revolution. But it's important to remember that the story of the Revolution doesn't begin with 2 lantern signals and Paul Revere's ride. The story begins with ordinary people whose names are mostly lost to history, deciding that the risks and uncertainties of revolution were preferable to the injustices of the status quo. They are all history makers.
Maddie, I'm a little taller than you. It's also important to remember that the story of the American Revolution doesn't end with liberty and justice for all. The 248 years that followed the lantern signals were marked by both ongoing struggles and significant progress. And when we reflect on the history of those decades and centuries, we can find hope and inspiration in the stories of those who worked for change. From the courageous fathers and sons who turned out on Lexington Common, to the determined abolitionists of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, to the defiant women who persisted through a decades-long struggle for suffrage, there are stories that can speak to all of us. 2023 marks the 300th anniversary of Old North Church. And tonight, you're going to hear about some of the ways that we are working to expand our programming and tell a story that is so much bigger than just one night. But it is that one night that secured Old North's place in our nation's origin story. 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, intentionally blends fact with fiction in an effort to inspire support for the Union cause on the eve of the Civil War. And Longfellow's words remind us that in the face of injustice, we can all make the choice to step forward. It's the opening lines of the poem that are the most famous, but for me, it's the verses in the final stanza that invoke the hour of darkness and peril and need that really tug at the heartstrings. And so as you listen to the words of the poem, I ask you to just go on the journey that Longfellow is giving and let yourself feel the urgency and the fear and the hope of that fateful night.
Susan Tran is our poem reader tonight. Susan is an Emmy Award-winning anchor and reporter with NBC 10 Boston. Whether she's reporting on breaking news, digging for an exclusive interview, or sharing the stories of extraordinary people, Susan's storytelling keeps us informed and engaged in our community. Please welcome Susan Tran.
Good evening. Again, my name is Susan Tran. None of my words will be as eloquent as Longfellow's, but I do want to acknowledge how very honored I am, a daughter of immigrants, to have the pleasure of reciting this poem about the founding of America. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm for the country folk to be up and to arm. Then he said goodnight with muffled oars, silently rowing to the Charlestown shore, just as the moon rose over the bay where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset, British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend through alley and street wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the trample of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed to the tower of the church, up the wooden stairs with stealthy tread, to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that around him made masses and moving shapes of shade by the trembling ladder steep and tall to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath in the churchyard lay the dead in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in the silence still deep and still, that he could hear like a sentinel's tread the watchful night wind as it went creeping along from tent to tent and seeming to whisper, all is well. A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead. For suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now gazed on the landscape far and near, then impetuous stamped the earth and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the Old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full on his sight a second lamp on the belfry burns. A hurry of hooves in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles in passing a spark, a struck by a steed that flies fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night. And the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land to flame with its heat. He left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic, meeting the ocean tides, and under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is the herd of the tramp of the steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge to Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of the river fog that rises when the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington and saw the gilded weathercock swimming in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting house windows, blank and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 o'clock by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadows brown, and one was safe and asleep in his bed. Who at the bridge would be first to fall? Who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball? You know the rest in the books you've read. How the British regulars fired and fled. How the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock on the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will awaken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Matthews, and I'm the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. When I introduce myself to people and I tell them what I do, I often hear, "Oh, I went there in 5th grade, but I haven't been back since." I'm willing to bet that some of you, maybe many of you, fall into that category. And tonight, I am here to tell you, you need to come back. A lot has changed, and we are telling Old North's 300 years of stories in fresh ways and with fresh perspectives. 300 years is an incredible milestone for Old North. Throughout those 3 centuries, this place has been a home for a community whose stories, struggles, and hopes can help us understand how we, as a nation, got to where we are today. I want to give you an example. Over the last year, we have invested in a research fellowship. Dr. Jamie Crumley is combing through the church's records, which are housed at the Massachusetts Historical Society. She's learning more about some of the free and enslaved African and indigenous peoples who were part of Old North's 18th and 19th century history. Her work is helping us understand the church's connections to enslavement and to colonialism, 2 challenging topics that have lasting implications for our city and for our nation. Through Jamie's work, she has reclaimed the identity of Beulah Speen. Beulah Speen was a Nipmuc and possibly Afro-Indigenous woman who married Saul Rogers, an enslaved Black man, here at Old North in 1767. Beulah Speen's racial journey is a compelling one, and it demonstrates that race was and continues to be a social construct. Now, by that, I mean race is an invention that societies have created to justify why some people should have more power or more rights than others. Born in Natick, a town settled by English missionaries for the purpose of converting indigenous peoples to Christianity, Beulah Speen's 1743 birth certificate, or birth record, indicates that she was not a person of color. However, Old North's records describe her as a mixed-race woman who married an enslaved Black man. Decades later, the 1790 federal census data indicates that Beulah Speen and her second husband and children were free people of color. Now, we don't know if Beulah's self-identity changed, but we do know that the way society identified her did. Her story begs the question, how and why has the construct of race changed over time? And what can that tell us about why racial inequity is still so pervasive today? This is just one example of how the stories of Old North's congregants are relevant to the questions and issues we grapple with today. We are celebrating 300 with a wide range of programming, including a brand new 40-minute audio tour with an accompanying learning guide for teachers across the country, and a redesign of the interpretive signage some of you are seeing in your pews. But what I am most excited about is a new play entitled Revolution's Edge, which will debut this June with a 14-week run here in this church, Old North. The play takes us to the afternoon of April 18th, 1775, just hours before the signal lanterns will shine from Old North's steeple. We meet three men, the Reverend Dr. Mather Biles Jr., the loyalist rector of Old North Church, Cato, an African man enslaved by Dr. Biles, and finally, Captain John Pulling Jr., a prominent member of the church congregation and an ardent patriot. These three men share a faith, but have very different beliefs concerning the right path ahead for the people of this land. Rooted in history and research, the play challenges us to see different perspectives and to understand how they relate to personal experience and beliefs. It is a great way to provoke conversation and to engage empathetically with the past. And now, it is my pleasure to debut the trailer for Revolution's Edge.
This day and the night that follows, they matter. But this very moment is small and delicate, almost invisible in the stories that get told later. That's how most moments are. They grow smaller and thinner the farther away we get.
"300 years ago, something like this very much happened in this church. And 300 years ago, it was not within their wildest dreams to think that we would be here in this space, and it would still be here telling the story. So I'm honored. You know, I'm honored and excited. Now I can have salvation too, thanks to Dr. Biles.
Did you go visit them to celebrate in Roxbury?
So much of theater is about being in the space and feeling the energy. And when you're in the Old North Church, like, all that's already done for you.
How many redcoats did you count at the neck?
Do not pull my servant into your mess.
There are more soldiers with every passing day.
On the surface, the play is about three men from Boston, all on the verge of war, three fathers of young children. The play is also about faith and politics and race and slavery, kind of all woven together into one.
Lord North and Lord Mansfield have given him orders to take a harder line to stop the rebellion.
I think the stories of Biles, of Pulling, and of Cato all tell us really important things about how we can recreate this country every day.
Captain Pulling asks a question that should not be asked. People don't ask slaves what they want to do or where they want to go.
I think that this play does a great job of reminding us that we are part of history, that this tapestry of history, it's this one giant continuum, and that who knows what kind of play will be produced at Old North, 250 years from now about us.
The characters are written in a way that helps to break down the presumptions and maybe misconceptions that we have today about patriots and loyalists. It really goes against the temptation to label those two sides as good and bad or us and them. And I think that's a really valuable lesson as we think about how to bridge divides in our communities today.
So you're all going to come, right? It's going to be so good. All right. Next, I'd like to welcome Nicole Moore to the podium. Nicole has been partnering with Old North Illuminated for the past 2 years on the development and implementation of our interpretive plan. Nicole is a public historian and consultant at Interpreting Slave Life with over 10 years of museum experience and expertise in interpreting the lives of the enslaved. Nicole is the Director of Education at the National Center for Civil Rights in Atlanta, where she is leading a multi-year expansion of educational content developed by and for the center. Engaging audiences that range from K-12 students to Fortune 500 C-suite executives to professional sports teams, Nicole urges groups to seek ways to protect the civil and human rights of all.
Wow. Good evening, everyone. As Catherine mentioned, I am a public historian. And that's a term that some of you may not know, so let me define it really quickly. Public history describes the many ways in which history is explored and engaged outside of the classrooms. So my goal is to make history and all of its complexities and its messiness accessible and relatable for all of you when you visit a place like Old North. Public history matters to me because I realize that there is much I did not learn in school. I learned basic facts and figures, but never the nuances of our shared histories. And for many of us, when we are honest and when we reflect back, you'll realize the same is true for you. And the voices that we left out, they matter. They give us a more complete story that leaves us thinking critically, asking questions, discovering new things, and then asking even more questions. That's how we learn, and that's how we move forward. And that learning is happening every day at historic sites and museums that are willing to tell those complex histories. Professor Annette Gordon-Reed work has been liberating and thought-provoking for me, both personally and professionally. Like, man. When I think about shaking the historical table and turning the narrative on its head, she is the leader that comes to mind. Goals. She has challenged the field in how we talk about our icons, how we tell the arc of American history, how we examine the historical record, and then face that reality of our history head on. For me, seeing a Black woman talk honestly and openly about the things we've long suspected, but wouldn't say out loud, in a field that has been long dominated by white men, it's been empowering. And it's allowed me to feel like I do belong in this space, and that my voice and that my work, that matters. It's for those reasons and many, many more. They wouldn't let me say all of them. It is my great honor to introduce Professor Annette Gordon-Reed to you. Professor Gordon-Reed is the Carl Loeb University Professor at Harvard. She has written 7 books and won 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2009 and the National Book Award in 2008 for The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, a classic. Her most recent book is On Juneteenth. A selected list of her honors includes a Guggenheim Fellowship in the Humanities, a MacArthur Fellowship known as the MacArthur Genius Award, the National Humanities Medal, the National Book Award, and the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. She was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2011 and was a member of the Academy's Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences. In 2019, she was elected as a member of the American Philosophical Society. She is the current president of the Ames Foundation and the Society of American Scholars. And most importantly, she is an inspiration to the next generations of historians who, thanks to her lead, will challenge the gaps and misconceptions in the historical record and present us with a shared national history that is inclusive and inspiring.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I could add to my accomplishments, making it up these steps. I don't think I've ever been this high talking to people before, but this is a wonderful view. You look great, all of you. I'm honored to receive the 3rd Lantern Award and to give the keynote address during the celebration of Old North's 300th anniversary. I'm also deeply honored to stand in a place that has meant so much to history, not just for Boston and Massachusetts, but for the nation as a whole. As a child growing up in Texas, very far away from here, I learned about the lanterns in the Old North Church and was taught the meaning of 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, along with Paul Revere's ride, and I'm so honored to meet Mr. Revere tonight. Stories that have brought throngs of visitors to Boston and to this site in particular, as places where the flames of the fire of the American Revolution were lit. So even though I was thousands of miles away, I felt connected to the history that was made in this place because it was an origin story for the beginnings of my country. Stories that connect us as Americans are so important. Unlike our European counterparts, certainly the country from which we separated, Great Britain, we are a young country. We do not have a culture and institutions developed over 1,000 years, or 5,000 years, if you compare us to China. We do not have a national religion or a national race, though unfortunately, some of our fellow citizens think we do, or should. The American ideals, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and the stories we tell ourselves about how we began, or how we have progressed over the years, or what we have used as the glue that holds us, however imperfectly, together. That is perhaps why the story of early America has always been contentious. A fight between those who wish to have a more inclusive story of our origins and those who prefer to tell a story of the few great men and a few great women whom we recognize as the founders of the country. The battle over the proper narrative of early America is raging today in school boards across the nation, in public libraries, and among some legislators who are angry about the new ways of telling the nation's story that seek to include all those who were actually in the American colonies in the 17th and the 18th centuries. Given the importance of the narrative to establishing American identity, the hostility to diversity in early America seems to me, at least, to reveal a longing to deny the Americanness of non-whites. If people of color were not there, or not particularly important to the story at the beginning, then how American can they really be? For my own part, the revolutionary story as it played out in Boston helped inoculate me as a child against the notion that Black people had not been a part of the story of early America and the American Revolution, and were somehow not truly American. It was right there in the story of Crispus Attucks. I learned that he had been killed. Indeed, he had been the first to fall at the hands of British soldiers during what has come to be called the Boston Massacre. In the books and magazines I read as a child, he was celebrated as a hero. I remember feeling a sense of pride about Attucks whenever he was mentioned in class. This was not just as a feel-good moment for me, but because the information was also being imparted to my white classmates, whom I suspected might be inclined to disbelieve that Blacks were even in America during the Revolutionary period. From what I could gather from their few mentions of African Americans in the past, their images of Blacks in American history centered on the cotton field almost exclusively, as if Black people arrived in America only during the antebellum period. The Attucks story disrupted that vision. There were no Black people working in cotton fields in Boston in March of 1770. The Attucks in Boston story was far away from all of that, both in terms of distance and in terms of decades. We now know more about the Boston Massacre and Attucks than we did when I first encountered both. I was too young to have known that attitudes about the event, the Boston Massacre, actually evolved over time. It was not always thought of as the high point in American history that I was taught it was. John Adams and others saw the men who fought with the British against the British as rabble-rousers. Now, of course, he was very famously, and courageously, I should say, the lawyer for the Redcoats who had fired on Attucks and the other colonials. It actually took some time for the meaning of that event to change, to become a positive thing. As for Attucks, I now know he was not solely African American. He was Black and Native American. He had escaped from slavery to become a sailor. I also know that, as with the Boston Massacre itself, his image has undergone changes as our society has changed. The first recounting of the altercation between the British and the American colonists left his name out of the story altogether. Once it surfaced, however, it was Blacks and their white allies in the abolitionist movement who brought him back into the picture and made him into a hero. Then there was some criticism of him during the era of Black power. People asked, why should this person of color have participated in a revolution that ultimately did not do away with the institution of slavery? Though it did set the stage for the end of slavery in Massachusetts and for gradual emancipation in northern states. Of course, the fact that Attucks was of mixed heritage would not have changed my response to the role he played in my imagination and his relationship to the narrative of American history. I understood at a young age that according to the racial rules in the country, his African descent and his origins as an enslaved person determined most strongly how he was perceived by others. In any event, in my mind, he was a person of color in a story that was otherwise portrayed as all white. That was very meaningful to me. Whenever I hear stories about the battle over what kind of books children can read in school libraries, and as things are shaking out, what kind of books adults can have access to in public libraries, or whether we should even have public libraries at all, I think about what the stories that widened the lens on American history meant to me when I was growing up. There is no doubt in my mind that they helped fuel a sense of belonging in me and made me think that I could and should read about and write about any era in American history, any figure in American history. It informed my thinking when in junior high school, I wrote a piece about a Black man who had participated as a soldier in the American Revolution, for which I won an award from the Daughters of the American Revolution. It informed my thinking when I decided as an adult to write about Thomas Jefferson as the drafter of the Declaration of Independence, as a political figure, and as a man who enslaved hundreds of people over the course of his life. It never occurred to me that I was not supposed to become a Jefferson scholar and seek to describe his life and times to readers. I recall an interview on 60 Minutes with Ruth Simmons, the former president of Brown University and Prairie View University, who told a story about being asked why she decided to major in French literature. She replied, and I'm paraphrasing her, "Because everything in the world belongs to me." I can't speak for Dr. Simmons, but I know my early experience reading books about all the different kinds of people who went into making the American experiment led to my adult desire to write American history in a way that brings all people into the picture. I understand that you at Old North Illuminated are committed to telling a broad, inclusive, and truthful story of all the people connected to Old North's history and legacy. This is a noble and essential endeavor. Every institution across the country with a long history should be doing the same thing. This is especially true now when challenges to American democracy threaten the experiment that got its start right here in Boston so long ago. Young people, like the girl I was, reading about the Boston Massacre and Crispus Attucks, need to learn the full story of how people of all races contributed to the birth and progress of the United States over the years. I'm grateful that you asked me to share this day with you, and I look forward to seeing what you will do as you continue to bring the full story of Old North and its legacy to all who visit here in the future. Thank you very much.
Two centuries after the lantern signal lit the path towards revolution, on April 18, 1975, President Gerald Ford began the nation's bicentennial celebration by lighting the third lantern here at Old North Church as a signal to guide our country with hope and fortitude into our third century. The Third Lantern Award honors those who are working to fulfill the promise reflected in those lanterns, a future that delivers on the promise of liberty and justice for all. Professor Gordon-Reed, it is our honor to present you with a third lantern. Please welcome Chief White Hammond and Sierra D'Amico, our neighborhood liaison from the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Services, to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. I'm here on City of Boston to present this citation to Annette Gordon-Reed. In honor of your significant contributes to the study and teaching of history and humanities and your ongoing efforts to bring an honest and expanded lens to stories and mythologies of our nation's origins. We recognize and honor the powerful impact of your work in the ongoing pursuit of liberty and justice for all. On behalf of the City of Boston, we congratulate you on this achievement and lifetime of accomplishments. Thank you.
I've been offered the opportunity to say a few words, and even though I am a pastor, I'm really gonna say only a few words. Sometimes you get up here and you just start going to the moment. But I just want to thank Professor Gordon-Reed for her words and for her work. As a woman of African descent who has relatively recently taken on the work of trying to understand and trace my lineage, I knew of your work before I knew your name. And your work to open up and really examine histories that have been whitewashed, that have been read through a patriarchal lens until they are cast in what is often just an untrue light. I think a lot of the work of womanist theologian Emily Towns, who talks about the perpetuation of the fantastic hegemonic imagination. The stories that we tell ourselves about superhumans who got it all right and who were always on the right side of history, the names and the people whose stories are erased. So I want to just thank you for your work. I want to thank the leadership at Old North Church and for the work that we're doing as a city. I think it is worth noting, I ran here because I was coming from the annual meeting of the Friends of the Public Garden and talking about the restoration of the Shah 54th Regiment Memorial, which as a child, I grew up with that. I just thought that was normal. I didn't know the deep controversy it took to remember the history of Black men who, despite the way this country had treated them, were willing to stand up and take up arms. And so I just want to thank you, and I want to thank all of you for choosing to be part of this work that we are called on to do. Not to demonize our ancestors, but to tell the truth. And to, from that truth, ask questions about who we will choose to be going forward. I'm going to make a little plug, because I know the work that's being done here is also being done in some of our historic churches across the city. And I want to give people the heads up that in June, we will be opening a new exhibit in Faneuil Hall to lift up the histories of enslaved peoples within this city, enslaved peoples of African and indigenous descent. And I hope you will come out. I hope you will continue to support the work of uncovering this history, not just so that we can look critically at who we have been, but so that we can decide to be different and to be better going forward. So I thank you for the work that you do. I thank you to the foundation, the work that brings us all here tonight. And I look forward, as the person who, we didn't explain who my role is, sorry, I oversee the Office of Historic Preservation in addition to some other things, parks and food justice and environment. It's never a dull day in my job. But just really, really thankful. And so it was a packed day, but I had to make it here because the work that you're doing here is part of what our city has to do to become who we should be. And it is part of the work that is allowing us to become a city with the first woman of color mayor, as a city with a cabinet that looks different than it ever has before. But we can't just go forward without a critical examination of our past and helping that to guide our path forward. So thank you.
Bessie Coleman inspires me to be courageous because she was the first Black woman in America to get a pilot's license and also was the first Black woman to get an international pilot's license across the whole world. She also was courageous because she performed tricks and stunts with her plane.
George Washington inspires me to be a leader because he led the Patriot troops to victory against the British when the odds were stacked against them. He reminds me that I can accomplish anything.
Maya Angelou inspires me to be compassionate because in her writing, poems, and advocacy, she often emphasized the importance of empathy and understanding in promoting social justice.
Victoria Woodhull inspires me to be courageous because she was the first woman to run for president, even though women weren't allowed to vote yet. She didn't let social restrictions hold her back.
Rosa Parks inspires me to be brave because she fought for change during the Civil Rights Movement.
Someone who inspires me to be courageous is Willie O'Ree, as he broke down the color barrier in the NHL and made it possible for people who look like me to play hockey.
Harriet Tubman inspired me to be brave because of her unwavering dedication to the abolitionist movement and her selfless efforts to lead hundreds of slaves to freedom through the Underground Railroad.
Ruby Bridges inspires me because she made white people and Black people go to the same school.
Good evening. Oh, no. Let's try that again. Sorry, daughter of an Episcopal priest and a Southern Baptist minister as a grandfather for 50 years. We're going to try that one more time. Good evening. Good evening. All right, that's much better. This is a house of the Lord, people. This is a house of the Lord. Okay. My name is Angela Johnson, and I'm a board member at Old North Illuminated. And in case you were wondering, I am inspired by Madam C.J. Walker, the first African-American woman millionaire and entrepreneur. She supported a number of organizations in her lifetime and after her passing, and provided foundational support for groups such as the NAACP, which owes a lot of its current history to the foundational support she provided. As a professional in the world of philanthropy and fundraising, yes, it's that time, it is on her shoulders that I stand. Old North Illuminated preserves and interprets the incredible significance placed to both the hundreds of thousands of visitors who visit this church each year and to the students in classrooms across the country. Some of you might be surprised to know that Old North offers 4 lesson plans that are currently being offered to over 5,000 students in 32 states. Now, I don't want to bring the mood down, but I think it is safe to say that we are living in some challenging times. When I scroll through the headlines over my morning tea, I gave up coffee 3 years ago. I see stories about increasingly divided communities, threats to our democracy, and more restrictions and censorship in the classroom. There seems to be a growing concern that children and teens are too young to learn real history. But we know that isn't true. They are curious, opinionated, and most importantly, they are paying attention to the world around them. And when we teach history honestly, with all its complexities and contradictions, it's fascinating. Yes, learning our nation's history can make us feel angry, sad, maybe even scared sometimes. But Old North's curricula and other educational materials equip students with the knowledge and tools they need to apply the past to the present and take action. Let me give you an example. Old North's cacao and colonial chocolate curriculum for high school students traces the history of chocolate through the Mayan, through colonial Boston, and the slave trade to the present-day chocolate industry, and sadly, its connection to child labor. Several months ago, a group of students who completed the program and then came to Old North for a field trip were so inspired that they petitioned their principal to make a policy change in their school and only sell fair trade chocolate on campus. Old North's curricula and enrichment materials are preparing young people to engage, speak up, and take action at a time when change is sorely needed. 5,000 students isn't enough. Next school year, we want to reach 10,000 students. We want to see that number keep climbing, and we depend on your support to help us get there. To those of you who have already made a contribution tonight, our heartfelt thank you. Tonight, we'd like to raise $10,000 to fund the expansion of our classroom programming. If you have been moved by what you heard or saw tonight, I am asking you to make a gift of any size in an act of solidarity and support. I invite you to join Old North Illuminated in our pursuit of a future in which everyone will see their stories, struggles, and hopes reflected in places of prominence such as this and our shared American history. There are 2 ways that you can make a gift tonight to support this important work. On the back of your program, you will find a QR code. You can scan that code with your phone's camera and make a gift online. If you prefer to donate offline, or like my mother and believe that QR codes are trying to scan your brain and do something crazy, you'll see a remittance envelope in your pew, and you can pop a check in or fill in your credit card info and hand it to one of the staff on your way out. They will be standing in the back. Please do not leave it on your pew seat. I am so confident that we can reach our goal of 10,000 that I am going to thank you in advance for your support. Let's all take a minute to make our gifts and listen to some beautiful music by Dr. Libor Dudash, Old North Church's music director. Thank you.
So I want to thank all of you for your generosity. I also want to thank the staff and all of our participants this evening who have given us such a special night. As special as it was, I know that you've all been sitting on wooden benches for over an hour, some of you almost an hour and a half. And I also know that I am the only thing between you and lit lanterns and birthday cake, so I'm really going to wrap it up. I had a whole plug that I was going to give about why you should come visit us this summer, but I think everyone that preceded me in the program has covered that. I do want to give one special plug, though, for something that hasn't been mentioned yet, which is that currently the historic crypt that is right down there under us, containing 37 tombs and about 1,100 occupants, is closed for restoration. So I do invite you to come back at the end of the summer when the crypt opens. I can guarantee that you will all enjoy the experience. And if you want a teaser of that experience, come find me in the tent and ask me about my favorite tenant, if you will, a man named Uncle John. I would love to tell you about Uncle. He's not my uncle, but he is somebody's Uncle John. So we're about to do our recessional, and Dr. Dudash is going to play a very special song for Old North, My Country 'Tis of Thee, which has been played every Sunday here at Old North since 1912. Some of you may be surprised to know that sometimes we sing it as God Save the Queen, or the King, as the case may now be. But I ask you to stay in your seats until the lanterns have gone out. And then the best way to see the lantern signal is to go across the street, make your way up Copp's Hill until when you turn around, you can see the very top window of the steeple. That's where you're gonna see the lanterns. And we will wait until everybody makes their way out. Some horses may make an appearance as well. That's one of my favorite parts. And then please come back into the tent and join us for a birthday party. It is not every night that you can go to a 300th birthday party. I think that most of you probably haven't been to one yet. So there will be burgers, there will be birthday cake. In my opinion, a birthday party is not complete without a magician, and so there will be one of those as well. So with that, I would like to invite our co-chairs, Maddie Rodriguez and Jonathan Chu, to the stage, as well as Paul Revere himself for the lighting of the lanterns. And don't light Annette's lantern, light the other two.